She wrote one of the most famous love stories in the English language. Her words have been read by millions, adapted into countless films, quoted at weddings and whispered between friends on rainy afternoons. And yet, when her first novel appeared in bookshops across London, the cover bore no name at all. Only 3 small words: by a lady. Even when Jane Austen held her own book in her hands for the very first time, even when she saw her words printed on paper that smelled of ink and possibility, she remained invisible, anonymous, unknown. Today, I want to tell you about that day, the autumn morning in 1811, when a small parcel arrived at a quiet cottage in Hampshire, and everything changed, while nothing changed at all. Come in, dear visitor, come in from the autumn chill. The leaves are falling golden outside my window, and there is a particular melancholy to October evenings that makes one long for stories. The fire is warm today, and I have something rather special to show you. Here, let me light another candle so you can see it properly. There, in the corner of my shop, beneath a stack of old letters tied with faded ribbon and beside a collection of ivory miniatures in gilt frames. Do you see it? That small wooden box with the brass hinges, its mahogany surface worn smooth by years of use. It is called a writing slope, a portable desk really, designed to rest upon one's lap or a table. Ladies of the Regency-era used them for correspondence, for keeping accounts, for all the written business of daily life. The lid lifts up, you see, to create an angled surface for writing, and inside, look, a glass inkwell, its rim still stained with traces of oak gall ink, dark as old tea. A groove where a pen once rested, worn by the pressure of fingers reaching for it again and again, and this, feel how smooth it is. This compartment for paper and correspondence, sized perfectly for the small sheets that were common in that era. Writing slopes were everywhere in the Regency period. Every gentleman had one in his study. Every lady of education kept one in her sitting room. They were as common as smartphones are today, essential tools for a world that ran on handwritten letters and personal correspondence. But this particular slope, with its worn mahogany and its small brass lock that no longer quite closes, belonged to someone extraordinary. Someone who sat before it day after day, year after year, filling page after page with stories that would outlive her by centuries. She never sought fame. She never put her name on a single book during her lifetime. She wrote in secret, hid her pages when visitors arrived, and published anonymously, content to be known only as a lady. And yet her stories, her characters, her wit and wisdom and sharp observations about human nature, they never faded. They only grew stronger with each passing decade. Let me tell you about her. Let me tell you about Miss Jane Austen and the day she finally became an author. The cottage stood at the edge of the village of Chawton in Hampshire, where the road from London curved past before continuing on to Winchester and the sea beyond. It was a modest house of red brick, with white painted windows and a walled garden where vegetables grew in tidy rows. Roses climbed the walls in summer, and in autumn the apple trees in the orchard bent heavy with fruit. Nothing grand, nothing fashionable. The kind of house that a passing traveller might glance at and immediately forget. But to Jane Austen, who had spent years moving from lodging to lodging, from cramped rented rooms in Bath to temporary quarters with her brothers, always a guest in someone else's home, this cottage was something she had almost given up hoping for, a home of her own, a place to belong. She lived there with her mother, her elder sister Cassandra, and their dear friend Martha Lloyd, who had become so much a part of the family that she felt more like a third sister than a guest. 4 women sharing a quiet life of reading and needlework and walking the green lanes of Hampshire. Her brother Edward, who had been adopted by wealthy relatives and inherited a great fortune along with the grand estate of Godmersham Park, had given them the use of this cottage on his Hampshire property. It was an act of generosity that changed everything. For the first time in nearly a decade, Jane had a room where she could write undisturbed, a table positioned by the window where the light was good, time that belonged entirely to her. On this particular morning in late October of 1811, Jane woke before the sun had risen. This was not unusual. She had always preferred the early hours, those precious moments when the house was silent and her thoughts could wander freely without interruption. She lay still for a moment beneath the quilted coverlet, feeling the chill of the autumn air on her face, listening to Cassandra's steady breathing in the bed beside her. The sisters had shared a room all their lives, from their childhood in the rectory at Steventon to their wandering years in Bath and Southampton. And even now, in their 30s, they found comfort in each other's presence. There was no one in the world who knew Jane better than Cassandra, no one who kept her secret so faithfully. Jane slipped from beneath the covers, her bare feet finding the cold floorboards with a familiar shock. She pulled a woolen shawl around her shoulders, the same grey shawl she had worn for years, soft with age and smelling faintly of lavender from the sachets she kept in her wardrobe. She crossed to the window and looked out at the garden below. Outside, the world was a study in grey and silver, the autumn mist lying heavy over the vegetable beds and the apple trees beyond. Frost had touched the grass, making it sparkle faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. A single bird sang somewhere in the distance, a robin perhaps, its song thin and sweet in the cold air. The world held its breath, waiting for the sun. She dressed quietly, choosing a simple muslin gown of blue and white stripes, warm enough for the season, but not so fine that she would worry about ink stains. Her hair she pinned up quickly, without consulting a mirror, twisting the brown curls into a simple knot at the back of her head. There was no one to impress, no one to see. That was the gift of this life, she thought. She could simply be herself, no pretense, no performance, no exhausting social obligations. Just the work and the words and the quiet satisfaction of a story taking shape. The stairs creaked as she descended, but she knew which boards to avoid from long practice. 3rd step from the top, she skipped entirely. 5th step, She kept to the left side. The sitting room below was cold, the fire from the previous evening having burned down to grey ash and a few sullen embers. Jane knelt before the hearth and began the familiar work of building a new fire, arranging kindling in a careful pyramid, adding small pieces of coal, coaxing a flame to life with the bellows. This too was part of her morning ritual, a task she had claimed for herself. The servants would not be up for another hour, and Jane valued this time alone. The fire caught at last, crackling softly, and she held her hands before it, feeling the warmth seep gradually into her fingers. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, shifting from black to grey to the palest hint of pink. Then she crossed to the window, to the small table that waited there like an old friend. It was a modest piece of furniture, this writing table, round and delicate, with a single drawer for her supplies and slender legs that seemed almost too fragile to support even the weight of a book. Some visitors had wondered aloud why a woman who wrote such sprawling, intricate stories chose such a tiny workspace. But Jane understood. The smallness forced her to focus. There was room on that table for only one thing at a time, the work itself. No distractions, no clutter, no excuse for the mind to wander. Just the page and the pen and the story demanding to be told. She lifted the lid of her writing slope and withdrew a sheaf of papers, closely written in her small, neat hand. The letters were so tiny that some people found them difficult to read, but Jane had learned to write this way out of necessity. Paper was expensive, and she could fit more words on each precious sheet by keeping her letters small and her lines close together. This was her new project, the story she'd been crafting for months, or rather, not new at all. She had written an early version of it years ago, back at Steventon, when she was young and hopeful and certain that publication would come easily. It concerned two sisters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, one all sense and practicality, the other all sensibility and romantic feeling, and the gentleman who complicated their lives. She had called it Eleanor and Marianne then, but the publisher to whom she had sent it had rejected the manuscript, and it had sat in a drawer for over a decade. But she had revised it thoroughly these past months, sharpening the wit, deepening the emotion, cutting passages that now seemed too youthful, and adding scenes that reflected all she had learned about life and love and disappointment. And now it was no longer a manuscript hidden in a drawer. It had been sent to a publisher in London, a Mr. Thomas Egerton of Whitehall. It had been accepted, actually accepted on commission, which meant she would bear the cost of printing but keep the profits if it sold. It was, at this very moment, being printed, set in type, bound in boards, real. The thought still made her heart race whenever she allowed herself to dwell on it. A published author. Her, Jane Austen, spinster, daughter of a country parson, long deceased, sister and aunt and friend, and nothing more in the eyes of the world. An author. Though no one would know it was her. The book would appear under the simplest of pseudonyms. by a lady. Her name would appear nowhere, her privacy would remain intact, and if it failed, if the critics savaged it or the public ignored it, no one would ever know it was hers. The thought was both comforting and strange. She wanted the book to succeed, of course she did, but she also wanted to remain invisible. Both desires lived inside her, and she had not yet reconciled them. She dipped her pen in the dark ink and bent over the page. But she was not working on Sense and Sensibility today. That was done, out of her hands, in the possession of the printers. Instead, she was writing something new, or rather, something old made new. Another manuscript from those hopeful Steventon years, revised and improved and reimagined. This one was called First Impressions, though she was not certain that title would remain. It concerned a young woman named Elizabeth Bennet, who was witty and clever and perhaps too quick to judge, and a proud gentleman named Mr. Darcy, who was perhaps too quick to dismiss. It was a story about first impressions and how deceiving they could be, about pride and prejudice and the long, difficult journey toward understanding. For the next hour, she wrote. The pen scratched against paper, a sound she loved, the sound of thoughts becoming permanent. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the garden and the lane beyond, the hedgerows and the fields stretching away toward the distant downs. And Jane Austen wrote, lost in the world she was creating, more real to her in that moment than the chair beneath her or the shawl around her shoulders. At 9 o'clock, as the household began to stir, Jane set down her pen and carefully closed her writing slope. It was time for her other duties, the domestic tasks that filled her days alongside the writing. She went to the small dining room where a fire had been laid by the servant and lit it herself, then set about preparing breakfast. Making the morning tea was her responsibility, one she had claimed for herself years ago and never relinquished. She enjoyed the ritual of it, warming the brown ceramic pot with hot water, measuring the tea leaves with care, neither too much nor too little, pouring the boiling water at exactly the right moment. The tea they drank was nothing special, the same black tea that most households of their station used, but Jane took pride in making it perfectly. It was a small art, like writing, and she approached it with the same attention. She arranged the tea things on a tray, the pot under its knitted cosy, the cups and saucers, the small pitcher of milk, the sugar bowl. Toast she made herself at the fire, holding slices of bread on a long-handled fork until they turned golden brown. The smell filled the room, warm and homely, and she felt a surge of contentment. This was her life now, simple, quiet, purposeful. After all the years of uncertainty, she had finally found her place. She heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see Cassandra descending, her grey morning dress buttoned neatly, her cap already pinned in place. Of all the people in Jane's life, Cassandra knew her best. They had been inseparable since childhood, sharing confidences and jokes and dreams, sharing a bed and a room and every secret of their hearts. Cassandra knew about the novel. She had read every draft, offered suggestions, caught errors of fact and lapses of grammar. She was the only person, besides the publisher and his staff, who knew the true identity of the author of Sense and Sensibility. "Good morning," Cassandra said, settling into her chair by the fire, reaching her hands toward the warmth. "You were up early again. I felt you leave the bed." "I could not sleep," Jane replied, pouring the tea into her sister's cup, adding milk the way Cassandra liked it. "My thoughts were too loud. I kept imagining things." Cassandra smiled, accepting the cup. She understood without needing to ask. "When is the post expected?" "Not until this afternoon," Jane said, taking her own seat and wrapping her hands around her cup. "If there is anything at all." They exchanged a look, a whole conversation passing between them without words. Both of them were thinking the same thing. The novel had been printed weeks ago, according to Egerton's last letter. He had promised to send copies as soon as they were ready. Author's copies, he called them, the traditional gift to the writer. And yet, day after day, the post had brought nothing but the usual correspondence. Letters from their brothers scattered across England, invitations from neighbours, news from their nieces and nephews, the ordinary fabric of family life. No parcel from London, no word of the book at all. Their mother descended next, moving slowly with the stiffness that came with her years. Mrs. Austen was nearly 70 now, a formidable woman who had once managed a household full of 8 children and now spent her days tending the garden and complaining with great enthusiasm about her various ailments. She had opinions about everything: the weather, the neighbours, the quality of the mutton at market, the shocking price of candles. Jane loved her dearly, but she had decided not to tell her about the novel, not yet. Her mother had a tendency to share news, especially exciting news, and Jane was not ready for the world to know her secret. Let the book prove itself first. Let it find readers and earn praise. Then perhaps she would reveal the truth. "Good morning, Mamma," Jane said, rising to pour another cup. "How did you sleep?" "Terribly," Mrs. Austen announced, settling into her chair with a dramatic sigh. "My hip pained me all night. I do not think I slept a single hour." "I am sorry to hear it," Jane murmured, though she had heard the same complaint yesterday, and the day before that, and every day for the past several years. Toast? Breakfast passed pleasantly enough. The 4 women gathered around the small table, the fire crackling, the conversation flowing easily. Martha Lloyd joined them, dear practical Martha, who had lived with them for years and felt like family, who helped with the household and never complained, who had become so woven into the fabric of their daily lives that it was impossible to imagine Chawton Cottage without her. They spoke of ordinary things, the weather, which had turned colder overnight, the condition of the roads, which were muddy after last week's rain, the news from London that had arrived in yesterday's paper concerning the war with France and the health of the King and other matters of national importance. Jane listened and nodded and contributed observations, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of bookshops, of her words on printed pages, arranged in type, bound in boards, placed on shelves alongside works by other authors, of readers she would never meet, strangers in drawing rooms across England, opening her story for the first time and entering the world she had created. After breakfast, Jane sat at the pianoforte in the sitting room and practiced her scales and exercises, as she did every morning without fail. She was not a brilliant musician, not like some of the young ladies she had known who could play with genuine feeling and technical skill, but she was competent, and she enjoyed the discipline of it, the way the music demanded her full attention and gave her thoughts a rest from the endless circling of words. Her fingers moved across the keys, finding the familiar patterns, and the notes filled the room like drops of water falling into a still pond. Cassandra sat nearby with her needlework, embroidering a handkerchief with tiny flowers, and for a while the sisters existed in comfortable silence, each absorbed in her own task. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily. Outside the window, a gardener's boy pushed a wheelbarrow past, whistling tunelessly. Then came the sound that made Jane's heart skip, the creak of the door. That particular door, the one that led from the entrance hall to the sitting room, had a distinctive voice. It groaned and complained whenever anyone opened it, a long, low creak that announced visitors more reliably than any butler. Jane had asked the servants not to oil the hinges. Let it creak, she had said. She wanted the warning. She needed the warning. Her fingers stilled on the keys. In one smooth motion, practiced 100 times, she closed the lid of the pianoforte, rose from her seat, and crossed to the small table by the window. Her manuscript lay there, covered only by a piece of blotting paper. She gathered the pages quickly, her heart pounding, slipping them beneath a basket of needlework, just as the door swung fully open and Mrs. Digweed appeared. "Good morning," the neighbour called cheerfully, already unwinding her shawl and removing her bonnet. "I was passing by and thought I would call. What a dreary morning it has been. I declare, I thought the fog would never lift. And the cold. I said to Mr. Digweed just this morning, I said, winter is coming early this year. Mark my words." Jane smiled and greeted her warmly, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. The manuscript was hidden. Her secret was safe, at least for now. She gestured for Mrs. Digweed to take a seat by the fire, called for the servant to bring fresh tea, and settled into the role that society demanded of her, the pleasant, attentive, unremarkable spinster daughter. Mrs. Digweed was a pleasant woman, full of gossip and good intentions, eager to share every scrap of news that had come her way. She spoke of her children, all 5 of them, and their various ailments and accomplishments. She spoke of her servants, the lazy housemaid and the gardener who drank, and the difficulty of finding reliable help these days. She spoke of the price of mutton at the Alton market, which was shocking, simply shocking, and the state of the roads, and the rumours about the new family that had taken the lease on Hartwood Farm. Jane listened attentively, nodding at appropriate moments, asking questions that encouraged Mrs. Digweed to continue. But all the while, a part of her mind was filing away details. the way Mrs. Digweed's voice rose when she was excited, the particular turn of phrase she used when delivering bad news, the unconscious gesture of her hand when she mentioned her husband. Everything was material. Everything could be useful someday, transformed and transmuted into fiction. The visit lasted nearly an hour. When Mrs. Digweed finally departed, wrapped again in her shawl and full of promises to call again soon, Jane let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "That was close," Cassandra murmured from her seat, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I saw you move those pages." "Too close," Jane agreed. But she was smiling too. It was a game they played, the two of them against the world, keeping her secret safe. There was something almost thrilling about it. After the midday meal, Cassandra suggested a walk. It was something they did often, the two of them, strolling along the lanes and paths around Chawton, their bonnets tied firmly against the wind, their half boots splashing through puddles. Sometimes they walked to Alton, the nearby market town, to visit the circulating library or purchase supplies. Sometimes they simply wandered, talking of books and family and the small dramas of village life, or saying nothing at all, comfortable in each other's silence. Today they took the road toward Alton. The fog had lifted at last, leaving the world washed clean and bright, the colours of autumn vivid against the pale blue sky. The trees had begun to turn, their leaves shading from green to gold and russet and crimson, and the hedgerows were thick with blackberries and rose-hips. Jane breathed deeply, filling her lungs with cool autumn air, feeling it sharpen her thoughts and clear away the cobwebs of the morning's social obligations. The lane was quiet, bordered by fields where sheep grazed peacefully and stone walls ran in neat lines towards the horizon. A farmer passed them in a cart, touching his hat respectfully. Two boys ran across the road ahead, chasing a spotted dog. Ordinary life continued all around them, undisturbed and unaware that one of these two plainly dressed women, unremarkable in their grey pelisses and sensible bonnets, had written a book that would still be read 200 years hence. "Have you heard anything?" Cassandra asked quietly, when they were sure no one else was near, from Mr. Egerton. "Nothing," Jane said, her voice carefully neutral. "I begin to wonder if something has gone wrong, if the printing has been delayed, or if there has been some difficulty with the binding, or if he has changed his mind entirely and decided not to publish after all. Surely he would have written if that were the case," Cassandra said reasonably. "He seems a man of business. He would not simply abandon the project without a word." "One would think," Jane replied, "but publishers are mysterious creatures. I confess I do not understand their ways. Perhaps he has 100 authors clamouring for his attention, and I am simply the least important among them." "You are not the least important," Cassandra said firmly. "You are the most talented. He is fortunate to have your work, and he knows it." Jane smiled, touched by her sister's loyalty. They walked in silence for a while, their boots crunching on the gravel road, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the fields and turning the remaining leaves to gold. "It will come," Cassandra said at last. her voice full of quiet certainty. "I am absolutely certain of it. Have faith, Jane. Have patience. The book is real. The printing is complete. The parcel is on its way. Perhaps even today." Jane did not reply. She wanted to believe it, wanted to share her sister's confidence. But she had learned over the years not to hope too fiercely for things. Hope was a fragile creature, easily wounded. She had hoped before many times and been disappointed. Better to expect nothing and be pleasantly surprised than to expect everything and be crushed. They reached Alton and conducted their errands. A length of blue ribbon for Martha, who had admired it in the shop window last week. A pot of orange marmalade for their mother, who claimed it helped her digestion. A new steel pen for Jane, to replace the one that had grown dull. At the post office, Jane inquired casually if there was anything waiting for them. The clerk checked his ledger and shook his head. "Nothing today, Miss Austen. Perhaps tomorrow." "Perhaps tomorrow," Jane echoed, and they began the walk home. The afternoon was fading when they reached the outskirts of Chawton. The light had turned golden, that particular honeyed light of late autumn afternoons, slanting through the trees and casting long shadows across the garden path. Jane's feet ached pleasantly from the walk. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She was thinking of tea and toast, of the fire in the sitting room, of perhaps an hour of reading by candlelight before dinner. Then she saw the boy, a young lad from the village, perhaps 12 years old, standing at their garden gate with a parcel in his arms. A brown paper parcel, rectangular and substantial, tied with coarse string. Jane's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. She could not move, could not speak, could only stare at that ordinary parcel as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "Delivery for Miss Austen," the boy called out cheerfully. "Come all the way from London, it has. Heavy, too." Jane still could not move. It was Cassandra who stepped forward, who took the parcel from the boy's arms, who pressed a coin into his grubby hand and sent him on his way with thanks. Then she turned to Jane, her eyes shining with tears that she would not let fall, not here in the lane where anyone might see. "It has come," she whispered. "Jane, it has come." They went inside, walking quickly now, almost running, their earlier dignity forgotten. The sitting room felt different somehow, charged with possibility, with the weight of a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. Jane's hands trembled as she untied the string, as she folded back the brown paper, as she lifted away the protective wrapping inside. And there they were, 3 volumes bound in blue boards, the modest binding typical of novels of the day. 3 small books, smelling of ink and paper and glue, solid and real in her hands. On the cover, printed in plain black letters, Sense and Sensibility. A novel. In 3 volumes. By a lady. Jane lifted the first volume. It was lighter than she had expected, lighter than the weight of all the years she had spent writing it, lighter than the hopes and fears she had invested in these pages. She opened it to the title page, running her fingertips over the printed letters, over her name that was not her name, by a lady. Then she turned to the first chapter, seeing her words set in type, official and permanent. no longer handwritten in her small, cramped hand, but printed for the world to read. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Her words, her characters, her story. This was real. This was happening. She was holding her own book. Cassandra moved closer, looking over her shoulder, her arm slipping around Jane's waist. "Oh, Jane," she breathed. "Oh, my dear, you have done it. You are an author." Jane could not speak. A feeling was rising in her chest, something too large for words, too profound for expression. It was like the moment when a child is first placed in a mother's arms, that rush of overwhelming love and terror and wonder. She had made this, these words, these characters, this story that had lived inside her for so many years. It existed now in the world, separate from her, with a life of its own. It would be read by strangers, discussed by critics, loved or hated or forgotten. But it would exist. Even after she was gone, this book would remain. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She did not try to stop them. Cassandra held her tightly, both of them weeping now, tears of joy and relief, and something like grief too, the grief of letting go. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, two spinster sisters in a modest cottage, sharing a moment that no one else would ever truly understand. On the cover, it said only, "By a lady." But in this room, in this instant, the truth was known and celebrated between them. That evening, after dinner, the household gathered in the sitting room as they always did. Mrs. Austen settled into her favourite chair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a sock for one of her grandsons. Martha took up her needlework, a cushion cover she had been embroidering for months. The fire burned cheerfully in the grate, and candles cast warm pools of light around the room, illuminating the familiar furnishings, the worn carpet, the china figurines on the mantelpiece. It was the kind of evening Jane loved best. Quiet, domestic, safe. Cassandra picked up one of the new volumes, her expression perfectly innocent, betraying nothing. "I found this at the circulating library in Alton today," she announced, her voice light and casual. "A new novel, just published. I thought we might enjoy it. Shall I read aloud?" Mrs. Austen looked up from her knitting with interest. "What is it called?" "Sense and Sensibility," Cassandra replied, tilting the book so her mother could see the cover. "It is by a lady." Jane kept her eyes fixed on her needlework, her needle moving steadily through the fabric, in and out, a rhythm she could maintain without thought. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain the others must hear it. Her palms were damp. She dared not look up, dared not meet anyone's eyes. "A novel by a lady," Mrs. Austen said, with a note of scepticism that Jane knew all too well. Her mother had opinions about lady novelists, and they were not always favourable. "Well, let us see if she can write. Most of them cannot, you know. Too much sentiment and not enough sense. Begin at the beginning, Cassandra. We shall give her a fair trial." And so Cassandra began to read, her voice clear and measured, filling the sitting room with words that Jane had written years ago, revised 100 times, polished until they shone. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park, in the centre of their property, where, for many generations, they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. Jane listened, hardly daring to breathe. These were her sentences, her rhythms, her carefully chosen words. She heard them now, as a stranger might hear them, and she found herself analysing, critiquing, wondering if this phrase was as good as she had thought, if that description went on too long. But she also felt something else, something like wonder. The words sounded good spoken aloud. They had a music to them, a flow and cadence that pleased the ear. The reading continued. Mrs. Austen laughed aloud at a witty observation about Mrs. John Dashwood, the exact line that Jane had laboured over for hours, trying to get the rhythm precisely right. "She is clever, this lady, whoever she is," Mrs. Austen remarked, looking up from her knitting. "She has a good ear for dialogue, and a sharp eye for character. I know a dozen women exactly like this Fanny Dashwood." Under the edge of her needlework frame, hidden from view, Jane felt Cassandra's hand reach for hers. Their fingers intertwined briefly, hidden beneath the fabric, a secret communication in a room full of people who suspected nothing. Jane squeezed back, a silent thank you for everything, for keeping the secret, for believing in her work, for reading aloud with such skill and care. Martha yawned and stretched. The fire crackled and popped. Mrs. Austen requested another chapter, and then another, caught up in the story despite her initial scepticism. And Jane sat perfectly still, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as her own family praised an author they did not know was sitting among them. She was invisible. She was anonymous. She was exactly where she had always wanted to be, inside a story, hidden but present, the secret heart of the tale. Later that night, long after the reading had ended and the household had retired to bed, Jane sat alone in the small room she shared with Cassandra. Her sister was already asleep, her breathing slow and steady, but Jane could not close her eyes. A single candle burned on the small table beside her bed, its flame dancing in the draught from the window, casting wavering shadows on the walls. The 3 volumes of Sense and Sensibility lay before her on the coverlet, their blue boards bright in the flickering light. She picked up the first volume again and held it in her hands, turning it over, feeling the weight of it, the reality of it. Such a small thing, really, when you thought about it. A few 100 pages, some ink, some paper, some thread and glue. Not heavy at all. And yet it contained a piece of her soul. Every sentence she had agonized over, every character she had lived with in her imagination for years, every scene she had written and rewritten until it felt exactly right. All of it was here, preserved forever in print. Even when she was gone, when her body had returned to the earth and her name was forgotten. This book would remain. Jane thought about the future, though she could not truly imagine it. She thought about the readers who might find this story and love it, who might see themselves in Eleanor's quiet strength or Marianne's passionate heart. She thought about young women navigating the difficulties of life and love, just as the Dashwood sisters did, trying to find their way in a world that did not always make room for their hopes and dreams. She hoped her book might offer them some comfort, some amusement, some companionship on lonely evenings. That was enough. That was more than enough. Then she set the novel aside and reached for something else, a blank notebook, its pages creamy and unmarked, waiting to be filled. She had been thinking about her next story for some time now, turning it over in her mind, watching it take shape. A story about first impressions and lasting love. About a young woman with more wit than fortune, more intelligence than beauty, who was too quick to judge and too proud to admit her mistakes. About a proud man who learned, slowly and painfully, to see beyond his prejudices and recognize true worth. The first line had been forming in her mind for weeks, demanding to be written down. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. The candle flickered in the darkness. The pen scratched against paper, a sound like whispered secrets. And in a small cottage in Hampshire, in a room she shared with her beloved sister, a woman who would never see her own fame began her next masterpiece, the story that would become Pride and Prejudice, the book that would be read by millions, loved by generations, adapted again and again for stage and screen. She did not know any of this. She knew only that the words were coming, flowing from her pen as naturally as breathing, and that she had to write them down before they escaped. Outside, the night was cold and silent. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and Jane Austen wrote on, alone with her characters, lost in the world she was creating, more alive in that moment than she had ever been. And so, dear visitor, that is the story of Jane Austen and the day her first novel arrived, a small parcel from London, 3 volumes bound in blue boards, a cover that bore no name, only those 3 mysterious words, by a lady. She never did put her name on her books, you know, not once, not in her entire lifetime. When Pride and Prejudice was published 2 years later, the title page read only, by the author of Sense and Sensibility. The world knew there was a lady somewhere writing these brilliant stories, but no one knew who she was. She remained invisible to the very end, a shadow behind the page, a voice without a face. She died in 1817, at the age of 41, far too young. Her sister Cassandra holding her hand as she slipped away. She never married. She never had children of her own. She never travelled beyond England, never saw the wider world. She never knew that her novels would be translated into every language on earth, read in every country, loved by generation after generation. In her lifetime, She earned a modest sum from her writing, a few £100, enough for small luxuries, but nothing like wealth. Recognition came only after death, when her brother Henry revealed her identity to the world, and readers finally learned the name behind the stories. But I think she would have been content with that. I truly do. She did not write for fame or fortune. She wrote because the stories demanded to be told, because the characters would not leave her alone, because she could not help herself. She wrote in the early mornings before the household stirred, hiding her pages when visitors arrived. She wrote by candlelight when everyone else was sleeping. She shared her secrets only with Cassandra, her dearest friend and confidant, the one person who understood everything. And in doing so, in that quiet, determined, invisible way, she created something eternal. There is a lesson here, dear visitor, if we care to find it. The world does not always recognize genius in its lifetime. The greatest artists often work in obscurity, their gifts unappreciated, their names unknown. They labor alone in small rooms, with no guarantee that anyone will ever read their words or see their paintings or hear their music. And yet, they persist. They create. They pour themselves onto the page or the canvas or the score, not because they expect reward, but because they cannot do otherwise. The work demands to be done. Jane Austen understood this. She wrote 6 novels that are still read today, still loved, still teaching us about human nature and the complexities of the heart. She did it all, without recognition, without applause, without ever seeing her name in print. And her stories survived. They more than survived. They flourished. Now then, dear visitor, the hour grows late and the candles burn low. This writing slope goes back to its corner now, where it can dream of all the words it once held, the letters and lists, the drafts and revisions, the stories that changed the world. Perhaps, if you listen closely in the quiet moments before sleep, you can still hear the scratch of a pen against paper, the whisper of a mind at work, the soft breathing of a woman who dared to write, even when no one was watching. Sleep well, dear friend. May your dreams be filled with country houses and candlelit ballrooms, with witty heroines and reformed heroes, with love stories that end in joy. And when you wake, remember this: every great story begins with someone brave enough to write it down, even if they never sign their name, even if the world never knows their face. Rest well, dear visitor. Rest gently, and know that somewhere, in a cottage or a castle or a quiet room of their own, another writer is beginning their masterpiece tonight. Just as Jane once did, long ago, in a small house in Hampshire, where the door creaked and the fire crackled and the words flowed like water, unstoppable and eternal. Good night, dear visitor. Good night.